Marcus Chen had hiked these Colorado trails for 15 years, but the rock slide from last month's storm had revealed something extraordinary. A narrow opening, barely wide enough for a man, led into darkness that seemed to breathe with ancient secrets. His headlamp swept across carved symbols that predated any known civilization in the region, and artifacts that shouldn't exist in this remote wilderness. The deeper Marcus ventured, the more the cave revealed connections to his own family history, connections that his late grandfather had taken to his grave. Photographs tucked behind loose stones showed faces he recognized from old family albums, and a leather journal bore his grandfather's handwriting, describing events that supposedly never happened. But how could his grandfather have known about this place when Marcus had discovered it by pure accident? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Marcus drove home with hands that wouldn't stop trembling. The leather journal sat on his passenger seat like a ticking bomb, its weathered cover bearing his grandfather's initials in gold lettering that had somehow survived decades of hiding. Every few miles he glanced at it, half expecting the impossible artifact to vanish, like some fever dream induced by too much mountain air and too little sleep. His grandfather, Chen Wei, had died when Marcus was 12, taking with him stories of old China and quiet wisdom about patience and perseverance. The man Marcus remembered spent his final years tending a small herb garden and teaching his grandson to play shanqians, lazy Sunday afternoons. Never once had he mentioned archaeological expeditions or secret societies. The house Marcus inherited from his parents sat in a quiet Denver suburb, its two-story colonial design offering none of the mysteries that apparently ran in his family's blood. But tonight, as he climbed the narrow stairs to the attic storage room, he carried questions that demanded answers only his grandfather's belongings might provide. Dust motes danced in the light from his phone's flashlight as Marcus pulled down boxes he hadn't touched since moving in 5 years ago. His grandfather's possessions had been carefully packed by Marcus's mother, each item wrapped in tissue paper and stored with the reverent care reserved for sacred relics. Marcus had always said as the boxes contained typical mementos of an immigrant's life. Photographs, letters from relatives in China, perhaps some traditional clothing or cooking implements. The first box yielded exactly what he expected: black and white photographs of stern-faced relatives, documents written in characters Marcus couldn't read, and a jade bracelet his grandfather had worn every day until arthritis made it too painful to put on. Nothing that suggested secret expeditions or hidden knowledge of impossible caves. The second box proved more interesting. Beneath layers of tissue paper, Marcus found maps. Not tourist maps or hiking guides, but detailed topographical surveys of remote mountain regions across the American West. Red ink marked specific locations, with notes written in his grandfather's careful English script. Site 7, dormant but responsive. Site 12, compromised. Avoid contact. Primary cache. Activation pending bloodline confirmation. Marcus spread the maps across the attic floor, his phone's light revealing a network of marked locations spanning from Alaska to New Mexico. The site nearest to his discovered cave bore a notation that made his breath catch. Emergency protocols active, family contact essential. The third box contained items that shouldn't exist in any rational universe. A compass made from some kind of dark stone, its needle pointing steadily northwest, regardless of how Marcus turned it. When he held it, subtle vibrations traveled up his arm, as if the compass were trying to communicate through touch rather than sight. Most unsettling of all, the needle seemed to be pointing directly toward the mountain, where he'd found the cave. Hidden in the box's false bottom, Marcus discovered correspondence that reframed everything he thought he knew about his grandfather's life in America. Letters from universities he'd never heard of, referencing expeditions to places that didn't appear on any map. Marcus could find funding documents from something called the Keeper's Archaeological Trust, references to bloodline obligations and inherited responsibilities that apparently passed from father to son through generations of Chen family members. One letter, dated just 2 weeks before his grandfather's death, contained a paragraph that made Marcus's hands shake as he read. "Why? The activation protocols are accelerating. We've confirmed unusual energy readings at 17 sites across the continental network. If something happens to me, ensure Marcus receives the proper training when he comes of age. The burden cannot pass to him unprepared, but it cannot be avoided indefinitely. The mountain will call to him when the time is right." The letter was signed Thomas Winters, with a return address in Boulder, Colorado. Dr. Thomas Winters. Marcus remembered the name from his grandfather's funeral, a distinguished older man who had spoken briefly with Marcus's mother, offering condolences and mentioning shared archaeological interest. Marcus had assumed he was simply a colleague from his grandfather's work at the local museum, where Chen Wei had volunteered as a translator for Asian artifacts. Now sitting surrounded by evidence of his grandfather's double life, Marcus realized that Dr. Winters might be the only person alive who could explain what was happening to him. The compass continued its steady vibration in his palm, and somewhere in the distance he could swear he heard the mountain calling his name. Dr. Sarah Winters answered her phone on the second ring, her voice carrying the crisp authority of someone accustomed to fielding calls about academic emergencies. Marcus had found her contact information through the university directory, listed as Professor of Archaeological Studies with a specialization in pre-Columbian civilizations. He hadn't expected Thomas Winters to have a daughter, much less one who had followed in what Marcus was beginning to suspect were very unusual family footsteps. "Dr. Winters, this is Marcus Chen. I think you might have known my grandfather, Chen Wei." The silence that followed lasted so long Marcus wondered if the call had dropped. When Dr. Winters finally spoke, her voice had changed completely, losing its professional confidence and taking on something that sounded almost like fear. "Marcus." "Yes, we've been wondering when you would call. Can you meet me at my office? Today would be better than tomorrow." The urgency in her tone convinced Marcus to drive to Boulder immediately, rather than wait for a more convenient time. The University of Colorado campus bustled with late afternoon activity as students crossed between buildings and professors hurried to evening seminars. Winters' office occupied a corner of the archaeology building, its windows offering views of the flatlands that seemed almost deliberately positioned to watch the mountains. Sarah Winters proved to be a woman in her early 50s, with prematurely silver hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and the kind of steady gaze that suggested she'd spent considerable time looking at things other people preferred not to see. Her office reflected her profession, shelves lined with artifacts from various cultures, maps covering most of the available wall space, and stacks of academic journals that suggested research extending far beyond typical university requirements. Marcus placed the stone compass on her desk without preamble. Dr. Winters stared at it for several long moments, then reached into her desk drawer and withdrew an object that made Marcus's breath catch. A fragment of polished black stone, roughly the size of a playing card, that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. "Obsidian mirror fragment," she said quietly, "from the same site where your grandfather found that compass 30 years ago. We've been waiting for someone from your family to come forward." "Waiting for what exactly?" Marcus asked, though part of him wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. Dr. Winters lifted the obsidian fragment, angling it so that light from her desk lamp struck its surface. Instead of showing Marcus his own reflection, the polished stone displayed something impossible. Images that moved like scenes from a film, showing people in clothing that belonged to a historical period. Marcus recognized, working with technology that seemed both ancient and impossibly advanced. "Your grandfather never told you about the keepers," she said, her voice carrying the weight of someone sharing a burden she'd carried alone for too long. "He thought he could spare you this responsibility. We all hoped the sites would remain dormant long enough for the knowledge to die with our generation." The images in the obsidian fragment shifted, showing Marcus glimpses of the cave he'd discovered, but populated with figures whose faces bore an unsettling resemblance to his own. The same high cheekbones, the same determined expression, the same careful way of moving that Marcus recognized from watching himself in mirrors. "The sites are waking up," Dr. Winters continued, "all of them across the entire network. Something is changing, and the mountains are responding to bloodlines they haven't acknowledged in decades. Your grandfather was one of the last active keepers, Marcus. When he died, we thought his site would go dormant permanently." Marcus watched the obsidian fragment cycle through images that seemed drawn from multiple time periods, all featuring the same cave, the same inexplicable technology, and faces that belonged to his family tree, stretching back further than any genealogy could trace. "What exactly is a keep?" he asked, though the compass in his palm was already providing its own answers through subtle vibrations that seemed to resonate with his pulse. "Someone who maintains the boundary between what the world knows and what it's ready to know," Dr. Winters replied. "The sites contain knowledge and technology that humanity isn't prepared to handle, has never been prepared to handle. The keepers ensure that these places remain hidden until the right time, and that time is now." Winters set down the obsidian fragment, its surface returning to ordinary black stone that reflected nothing more than lamplight and Marcus's increasingly worried expression. "We're not sure," she admitted, "but the fact that the cave revealed itself to you, that the artifacts are responding to your presence. Marcus, some discoveries are meant to remain hidden. Your grandfather understood that better than anyone." Marcus thought about the journal entries, the maps, the careful notations about sites across the American West. But he kept detailed records. He was studying these places, not just guarding them, because something is coming, Dr. Winters said quietly. "Something that will require every site to be opened and every bloodline to accept their inheritance. Your grandfather spent his life preparing for this moment, hoping it wouldn't come in his lifetime." She opened her desk drawer again, withdrawing a manila folder, thick with documents and photographs. "I'm going to help you, Marcus, not because I want to, but because what happens if I don't will be much worse than what happens if I do." The return journey to the cave felt different with Dr. Winters beside him. Where Marcus had approached his first discovery with the casual curiosity of an experienced hiker, he now carried the weight of knowledge that transformed every shadow into a potential threat and every unusual rock formation into something that might be watching them back. Dr. Winters had insisted on bringing equipment that seemed more suited to a scientific expedition than a simple cave exploration. Electromagnetic field detectors, portable spectrometers, and several devices Marcus couldn't identify but that hummed with subtle electronic activity. "The sites respond to emotional states," Dr. Winters explained as they climbed the final ridge before the cave entrance. "Particularly stress, fear, and determination. Your grandfather learned to approach his site with the kind of calm meditation that kept the more volatile artifacts dormant." Marcus wondered what his emotional state was broadcasting to whatever intelligence waited in the mountain's depths. Curiosity mixed with apprehension, excitement tempered by the growing understanding that his normal life was ending regardless of what choices he made in the next few hours. The stone compass in his backpack had grown noticeably warmer during the hike, its vibrations intensifying as they drew closer to their destination. The rock slide that had revealed the cave entrance looked different in afternoon light, less like a random geological event and more like something deliberately arranged to occur at precisely the right moment. Winters examined the exposed opening with professional interest, running her fingers along stone edges that were too smooth to be entirely natural. "Artificial weathering," she murmured. "Someone wanted this entrance to look like it had been hidden by accident." The narrow passage that had seemed mysterious during Marcus's first visit now felt almost welcoming, as if the mountain recognized their return and approved of their purpose. Winters activated several of her devices before they entered, their soft electronic chirping creating an odd harmony with the cave's natural acoustics. 20 feet into the passage, they encountered Marcus's first real surprise. The cave was larger than he remembered, much larger. Passages branched off in directions he was certain hadn't existed during his initial exploration, leading deeper into the mountain through tunnels that showed clear signs of deliberate construction. Carved symbols covered the walls in intricate patterns that seemed to shift and change when viewed peripherally, creating the unsettling impression that the cave was rewriting itself as they watched. Winters consulted her electromagnetic detector, its display showing readings that made her frown with concern. "The field strength here is off the charts," she said. "Whatever's generating this energy has been building for weeks, possibly months." They followed the main passage deeper into the mountain, their headlamps revealing chambers that defied any rational explanation. Smooth walls curved upward into darkness that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Technology that appeared to be carved from single pieces of stone, hummed with barely audible energy, displaying symbols that rotated and changed in response to their presence. In the largest chamber they'd discovered so far, Marcus found what had been calling to him since his first visit. A crystal formation unlike anything he'd encountered in 15 years of mountain hiking. Translucent, roughly the size of a football, suspended in the center of the chamber without any visible support system. The crystal pulsed with soft light that seemed to originate from within its structure, and as they approached, it began producing sounds that were almost musical. "Crystal resonator," Dr. Winters breathed, her voice carrying a mixture of awe and concern. "I've read about these in my father's notes, but I never thought I'd see one active." Marcus reached toward the crystal before Dr. Winters could stop him. The moment his fingers made contact with its surface, the entire chamber exploded into activity. Light flowed along carved channels in the walls, creating patterns that seemed to map the cave's entire structure. The humming of hidden machinery grew louder, and somewhere in the distance, Marcus could hear the sound of heavy mechanisms activating after decades of dormancy. But the most startling change was in Marcus himself. The crystal's vibrations traveled through his nervous system, creating a sensation of connection that extended far beyond the immediate chamber. He could feel the mountain's consciousness, ancient and patient, recognizing something in his touch that it had been waiting generations to encounter. Images flooded his mind, his grandfather standing in this same chamber, learning to interface with technology that predated recorded history. Other figures from earlier generations, all bearing family resemblances that suggested this responsibility had passed through his bloodline for far longer than any written records could document. The crystal's song intensified, and Marcus realized it wasn't just responding to his presence. It was calling to something else, sending signals that traveled through the mountain and beyond, announcing to whatever network connected these sites that the Chen family guardian had finally returned to claim his inheritance. Dr. Winters grabbed his arm, pulling him away from the crystal. "Marcus, we need to leave, now. That signal is going to attract attention we're not prepared to handle." But as they turned to leave, Marcus noticed something that made his blood run cold. Fresh footprints in the cave dust, leading deeper into the mountain. Someone else had been here recently, and they'd gone further into the site than Marcus had yet dared to explore. The footprints led them deeper into passages that Marcus was certain hadn't existed during his first visit. The mountain seemed to be reshaping itself, opening pathways that had remained sealed for decades, responding to his presence with architectural changes that defied every law of physics he'd learned in college. Winters followed close behind, her equipment registering energy readings that made her increasingly nervous. "The structural modifications are happening in real time," she whispered, examining walls that showed signs of recent movement. "The mountain is literally reconfiguring itself." They emerged into a vast chamber that stretched beyond the reach of their headlamps, its ceiling lost in darkness that seemed to have weight and presence. At the chamber's center stood a platform, carved from what appeared to be a single piece of black stone, its surface polished to mirror smoothness. And standing on that platform, translucent but unmistakably real, was a figure Marcus recognized from old family photographs. His grandfather, Chen Wei, appeared exactly as Marcus remembered him from childhood visits, wearing the simple clothes he'd favored in life and carrying the patient expression that had made him such an effective teacher. But this wasn't memory or hallucinations. The figure turned to face them with deliberate awareness, its eyes holding intelligence that belonged to the present moment rather than the past. "Marcus," the apparition spoke in his grandfather's voice, though the sound seemed to come from the chamber itself rather than any physical source. "You've grown into the man I hoped you would become." Dr. Winters stepped backward, her hands fumbling for equipment that suddenly seemed inadequate for their situation. "This isn't possible," she murmured. "The preservation protocols weren't designed to maintain full consciousness." The figure of Chen Wei smiled with familiar warmth. "Possibility is a concept that changes dramatically when you understand how little humans actually know about their own world. Sarah, your father prepared you well, but some knowledge can only be transmitted through direct experience." Marcus approached the platform, despite Dr. Winter's restraining hand on his arm. The closer he came to his grandfather's figure, the more solid it appeared, until he could see individual details that belonged to memory. The small scar on his left hand from a childhood accident, the way his eyes crinkled when he was pleased about something, the patient posture of someone accustomed to waiting for understanding to develop naturally. "You're really here," Marcus said, though he wasn't sure whether he was making a statement or asking a question. "I'm here in the way that matters most," his grandfather replied. "The mountain preserves consciousness, Marcus. Not just memory or recorded information, but the essential awareness that makes each guardian unique. I've been waiting to pass the final knowledge to you." Behind his grandfather's figure, the chamber's walls began displaying images that moved with film-like fluidity. Marcus watched himself as a child, playing in his grandfather's garden, while the old man worked among plants that Marcus now realized hadn't been chosen randomly. Herbs and flowers that appeared decorative had actually served as components in preparations that kept his grandfather's connection to the mountain stable and strong. "The role of a keeper isn't what Sarah's father taught her," Chen Wei continued. "We're not just guardians or protectors, we're bridges between human consciousness and something far older and more complex than civilization has ever acknowledged." The memory stone tablet that served as the chamber's floor began displaying scenes from earlier generations. Chen ancestors working with the same impossible technology, each generation learning to interface more completely with the mountain's consciousness. Each guardian building on the knowledge passed down through bloodlines that stretched back to humanity's earliest encounters with forces that existed before recorded history. "You have a choice to make," his grandfather said, and suddenly the chamber felt smaller, more intimate, as if the vast space had contracted to accommodate a conversation that belonged between family members rather than guardian and successor. "You can accept the responsibility that your bloodline lies carried for 30 generations, or you can walk away and let the mountain return to dormancy." "What happens if I walk away?" Marcus asked. The images around them shift, showing scenes of chaos, mountains shaking with uncontrolled energy, technology activating without guidance, and something dark spreading across landscapes that looked familiar but wrong, as if photographed through filters that revealed threats, invisible to normal perception. "The network is awakening whether we guide it or not," Chen Wei explained. "Other forces have been working to corrupt the sites, to turn preservation into destruction. Without properly trained keepers, the technology becomes a weapon rather than a safeguard." Dr. Winters stepped onto the platform, her scientific training warring with evidence that challenged every rational framework she'd developed for understanding the world. "What kind of forces?" she asked. Chen Wei's expression grew solemn. "People who believe that power should belong to those clever enough to steal it, rather than those wise enough to protect it. They've been hunting keeper bloodlines for decades, turning some of our own against the network." The chamber's displays shifted again, showing Marcus images of people he didn't recognize working with corrupted versions of the artifacts he'd discovered. Their technology looked similar but felt wrong, as if someone had reverse-engineered devices they didn't truly understand and modified them for purposes that served destruction rather than preservation. "The training will change you," his grandfather warned. "You'll still be human, but you'll also be something more. The connection to the mountain cannot be broken once it's fully established." Marcus looked at Dr. Winters, seeking guidance from someone who understood both the scientific and mystical aspects of his situation. Her expression reflected the same uncertainty he felt, the weight of choices that would define not just his future, but potentially the future of every site in the network. "Will I still be myself?" he asked. Chen Wei smiled with the same patient warmth Marcus remembered from childhood. "You'll be more yourself than you've ever been, grandson. The mountain doesn't diminish human consciousness, it reveals its true potential." Marcus reached for the multifaceted crystal his grandfather indicated, its surface containing more angles than seemed geometrically possible. The moment his fingers made contact, the chamber dissolved around him, replaced by visions that felt more real than his own memories. The time echo prism transported his consciousness backward through layers of history, each facet revealing the mountain's story across centuries of human interaction. He watched ancient peoples approach the cave with reverence, carrying offerings that seemed designed to communicate with something they understood lived within the stone itself. These weren't primitive rituals, but sophisticated protocols developed through generations of careful observation and respectful contact. The mountain had been responding to human consciousness far longer than recorded history suggested, forming partnerships with those who approached it with wisdom rather than greed. The visions shifted forward through time, showing him Spanish explorers who discovered the site in the 16th century. Unlike the indigenous peoples who had worked with the mountain's consciousness, these newcomers tried to extract rather than cooperate. Marcus watched their leader, a conquistador whose name the mountain had deliberately forgotten, attempt to remove artifacts by force. The mountain's response was swift and final. The passages sealed themselves, trapping the intruders until their bones became part of the stone they had tried to violate. Centuries later, the prism revealed the first of Marcus's ancestors to work with the site, a Chen family member who had traveled from China during the California gold rush, following maps and instructions passed down through family lines that originated in temples older than written language. This ancestor hadn't come seeking gold, but responding to dreams that called him across oceans to fulfill responsibilities his bloodline had carried since before the concept of nations existed. Marcus witnessed his great-great-grandfather learning to interface with the mountain's technology, spending months in meditation and careful study before the site accepted his guardianship. The training required sacrifices Marcus hadn't anticipated. The Guardian lived apart from normal human society, visiting family only briefly before returning to his duties as keeper of knowledge that humanity wasn't ready to understand. The visions accelerated through generations of Chen Guardians, each adding to the accumulated wisdom, while facing challenges that grew increasingly complex as human technology advanced. World War II brought government agents who had detected energy readings from the site, forcing Marcus's great-grandfather to use the mountain's defensive capabilities to create landslides that blocked access routes and convinced official investigators that the readings had been geological anomalies. The 1960s revealed a different kind of threat, individuals who combined academic knowledge with darker purposes, using scientific methods to locate sites across the American West. Marcus watched his grandfather, young and newly trained, coordinate with other keepers to prevent these shadow seekers from gaining access to artifacts that could transform preservation technology into weapons of mass destruction. Each generational transition required the mountain to evaluate whether the bloodline remained worthy of its trust. Marcus saw guardians who had failed the test, their connections severed, when greed or fear corrupted their ability to serve the network's true purpose. These failures resulted in dormant sites that remained sealed until worthy successors could be identified and trained, sometimes waiting decades for the right combination of bloodline heritage and personal character. The prism showed him his grandfather's final years, working alone as other sites went dark, and keeper families either died out or abandoned their responsibilities. Chen Wei had maintained his site through pure determination, knowing that its technology would be essential. Sarah Martinez had been hiking these remote mountain trails for 15 years, but she'd never seen terrain quite like this. The GPS on her phone had lost signal 3 hours ago, and the hand-drawn map from the ranger station seemed to bear little resemblance to the winding path they'd been following. Her hiking partner, Marcus Chen, adjusted his backpack straps and squinted at the fading daylight, filtering through the dense canopy of pine and oak. "We should have turned back at that last fork," Michael said, his voice carrying the edge of concern they'd both been trying to ignore. The trail had grown increasingly narrow and overgrown, suggesting few travelers passed this way. Sarah pulled out her blood-stained hiking journal, its leather cover worn from years of documenting wilderness adventures. She flipped to today's entry, noting the strange rock formations and the complete absence of wildlife sounds that had marked the last 2 miles of their journey. Something felt wrong about this place, though she couldn't articulate exactly what. That's when they saw the smoke. A thin column of grey rose from beyond a ridge ahead, too steady and controlled to be a forest fire. Sarah and Michael exchanged glances. They hadn't seen another human being in 2 days, and the possibility of shelter for the night was becoming increasingly appealing as temperatures began to drop. "Could be a cabin," Michael suggested hopefully. "Maybe someone who can point us back toward the main trail." They climbed the ridge with renewed energy, their boots finding purchase on loose shale and exposed roots. At the crest, they stopped short. Below them lay a valley that seemed untouched by time, a collection of weathered wooden buildings arranged around a central square. Smoke rose from several chimneys, and warm light glowed in windows. It looked like something from a historical photograph, complete and self-contained. "I don't remember seeing this on any map," Sarah whispered, though she wasn't sure why she was whispering. The village appeared to house maybe 40 or 50 families, based on the number of structures. Gardens and small livestock pens surrounded the buildings, and a stream meandered through the settlement before disappearing into the forest on the far side. It was picturesque in an unsettling way, too perfect and isolated. As they descended toward the village, Sarah noticed the complete absence of modern conveniences. No power lines, no satellite dishes, no vehicles of any kind. Even the most remote mountain communities usually showed some connection to the outside world, but this place seemed frozen in an earlier century. A woman emerged from one of the larger buildings as they approached, her long skirt and wool shawl reinforcing the impression of stepping back in time. She was perhaps 50, with graying hair pulled back severely and eyes that seemed to assess them with careful calculation. "Travelers," she said, not quite a question. Her voice carried an accent Sarah couldn't place, something that suggested isolation rather than foreign origin. "You're far from the main roads." "We're lost," Michael admitted. "Our GPS stopped working, and we've been walking in circles for hours. We're hoping someone might point us toward the ranger station." The woman's expression softened slightly. "I'm Martha Brennan. You're welcome to shelter for the night. The mountain paths are treacherous in darkness, and there are things in these woods that don't take kindly to strangers wandering about." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cooling air. The woman's phrasing struck her as oddly ominous, but exhaustion and the prospect of a warm meal overcame her unease. Martha led them toward the central square, where other villagers had begun to emerge from their home. Children peered curiously from doorways while adults watched with expressions that seemed more wary than welcoming. Sarah noticed that everyone was dressed in the same anachronistic style, as if they'd all stepped out of a 19th century photograph. "We don't see many outsiders," Martha explained as they walked. "Perhaps once or twice a year, if that. Most folks who find us are usually in some kind of trouble." The village square centered around a large stone well and what appeared to be a communal cooking area. Several women were preparing what looked like the evening meal, working with practiced efficiency over open fires. The smell of cooking meat filled the air, rich and gamey in a way that made Sarah's stomach growl. "We have a guest house of sorts," Martha continued. "Nothing fancy, but clean and warm. Supper will be ready soon, and you're welcome to join us. We believe in taking care of those the mountain delivers to our door." As Martha spoke, Sarah caught sight of children gathering around the cooking fires. their faces bright with anticipation. They seemed normal enough, laughing and chattering in the way children do when a meal is approaching. But something in their excitement struck her as unusual, almost predatory in its intensity. Michael was already nodding gratefully at Martha's offer, clearly relieved to have found shelter. Sarah forced herself to smile and express similar gratitude, though an instinct she couldn't name continued to whisper warnings she wasn't ready to hear. Crucial when the network faced its greatest challenge. Marcus watched his grandfather prepare detailed records and training materials, hoping his grandson would prove worthy when the mountain finally called to him. But the most disturbing visions came from recent years. The prism revealed shadow seekers who had evolved beyond their earlier crude attempts at theft, developing sophisticated methods for corrupting both artifacts and the guardians who protected them. These modern threats used technology that seemed familiar yet wrong, as if someone had successfully reverse-engineered keeper artifacts, but misunderstood their fundamental purpose. Marcus saw sites across the continent where corrupted guardians worked with shadow seeker agents, using preservation technology to create weapons that could manipulate weather patterns, trigger earthquakes, and influence human consciousness on a massive scale. The network that had once protected humanity from knowledge it wasn't ready to handle had been partially transformed into a tool for those who believed power should belong to whoever was clever enough to seize it. The final vision showed him something that made his blood run cold, a gathering of shadow seeker leaders planning a coordinated assault on the remaining uncorrupted sites. The attack was scheduled to coincide with an astronomical alignment that occurred only once every 1,000 years, when the network's defensive capabilities would be temporarily weakened by natural cosmic forces. Marcus found himself back in the chamber, the time echo prism warm in his hands, and his grandfather's figure watching him with patient concern. Dr. Winters was examining readings on her equipment that suggested the visions had lasted several hours rather than the minutes Marcus had experienced. 3 days, Chenwei said quietly. The alignment begins in 3 days, and the shadow seekers know exactly when we'll be most vulnerable. The question is whether you're ready to accept training that normally takes years to complete. Winters spread the star map codex across her kitchen table, its intricate astronomical charts revealing patterns that had taken her 3 sleepless nights to decode. The ancient document showed celestial alignments that occurred only once every 1,000 years, when specific planets and star systems created gravitational resonances that affected the network's protective barriers. According to the codex's calculations, the alignment would reach its peak in exactly 68 hours. Your grandfather wasn't the only one who kept detailed records, Sarah explained, pointing to symbols that corresponded to sites across 6 continents. My father spent 40 years documenting the global network, and what he discovered should terrify anyone who understands the implications. Marcus studied the map while nursing his 4th cup of coffee since dawn. Sleep had proven impossible since his encounter with his grandfather's preserved consciousness, his mind processing revelations that challenged every assumption he'd held about reality. The star map showed connections between sites that suggested the network operated on a scale far beyond anything he'd imagined. There are 47 active sites worldwide, Dr. Winters continued, her finger tracing lines that connected points across continents. Each one contains technology that could reshape human civilization if properly understood, or destroy it if corrupted and misused. During normal cosmic conditions, the sites maintain their own defenses. But during the alignment, those barriers weakened significantly. The codex included historical references to previous alignments, documenting how ancient keeper societies had prepared for these vulnerable periods. Marcus read accounts of coordinated attacks that had occurred during past alignments, describing battles fought with weapons that sounded more like science fiction than historical fact. Energy beams that could level mountains, devices that manipulated weather on a continental scale, and artifacts that could influence human consciousness across vast distances. The Shadow Seekers have been planning this for decades, Sarah said, producing additional documents her father had compiled before his death. They've identified 19 sites where they've successfully corrupted or eliminated the Guardian family. During the alignment, they plan to activate all corrupted sites simultaneously, using their combined power to overwhelm the remaining protective network. Marcus examined photographs of Shadow Seeker agents taken at various locations around the world. The images showed people who looked like ordinary academics and business professionals, but their eyes held an intensity that suggested obsession bordering on madness. These weren't simply treasure hunters or power-hungry criminals. They believed they were destined to inherit technology that would allow them to reshape human civilization according to their vision. What happens if they succeed? Marcus asked, though he suspected the answer would be worse than he wanted to imagine. Sarah pointed to calculations in the codex's margins, numbers that represented energy outputs beyond anything human technology could currently measure. Best-case scenario, they trigger uncontrolled releases that make nuclear weapons look like firecrackers. Worst case, they tear holes in reality itself that let in things that make the Shadow Seekers look like amateur vandals. The star map included detailed information about Keeper bloodlines, showing how Guardian families had been systematically targeted and eliminated over the past century. Marcus traced genealogical charts that revealed the deliberate nature of these attacks, assassinations and accidents that had removed potential Guardians before they could accept their responsibilities. My family wasn't randomly chosen for this role, Marcus realized, studying bloodline documentation that stretched back 30 generations. We're genetically compatible with the network's technology in ways that can't be duplicated or transferred. Exactly, Sarah confirmed. The sites don't just respond to training or knowledge. They require specific biological markers that exist only in certain family lines. The Shadow Seekers can steal artifacts and reverse engineer technology, but they can't replicate the consciousness interface that makes someone a true keeper. Marcus found his own family tree in the codex, noting gaps where potential guardians had died under suspicious circumstances. His grandfather had survived longer than most, protecting his site through a combination of careful secrecy and strategic isolation. But the documents made clear that Marcus was likely the last viable guardian for his site, possibly the last Chen family member with the necessary genetic markers. The alignment affects more than just the protective barriers, Sarah explained, turning to charts that showed energy flow patterns between sites. During peak alignment, the sites can share power across the entire network. A properly coordinated defense could use this connection to strengthen rather than weaken the protective systems, but that requires guardians at every site working in perfect harmony, Marcus said, recognizing the challenge they faced. Sarah nodded grimly. 28 remaining sites with confirmed active guardians. 19 sites already corrupted and working against us. The mathematics aren't encouraging. She produced a final document that made Marcus's heart sink. Intelligence reports indicating Shadow Seeker assault teams were already moving toward target sites. Professional mercenaries, equipped with weapons designed specifically to penetrate Keeper defenses, supported by corrupted guardians who understood exactly how to exploit each site's vulnerabilities. We have one advantage, Sarah said, pointing to a specific notation in the star map. Your site is the network's primary hub during alignment conditions. If you can successfully complete your Guardian training and establish full connection with the mountain, you could coordinate defensive responses across all remaining sites. Marcus studied the implications of this revelation, understanding that his decision to accept or reject his inheritance would determine not just his own fate, but the survival of a preservation network that had protected humanity for thousands of years. The weight of responsibility felt crushing, but the alternative was worse. A world where ancient wisdom became a weapon in the hands of people who lacked the wisdom to use it properly. The communication amulet arrived by courier at dawn, its silver surface warm to the touch, despite having traveled overnight in a refrigerated transport case. Winters signed for the package with hands that trembled slightly. recognizing the pendant from her father's descriptions, but never having seen one active. The amulet's central stone pulsed with soft blue light that intensified when Marcus approached, responding to his proximity with the kind of recognition that suggested intelligent awareness. "Emergency protocols," Sarah explained, lifting the pendant carefully from its protective case. "The network only activates these during crisis situations. The last time one was used was during the Cuban Missile Crisis, when several Guardians thought nuclear war might trigger uncontrolled site activations." Marcus touched the amulet, and immediately his consciousness expanded beyond the confines of Dr. Winter's kitchen. Voices spoke directly into his mind, not as auditory experiences, but as thoughts that carried emotional context and visual information along with their words. Guardians from around the world were connected through the network, their fears and determinations flowing through the amulet like water through interconnected channels. Anna Volkov spoke from her site in the Ural Mountains, her mental voice carrying the weariness of someone who had been fighting for days. Moscow's site went dark 6 hours ago. Dmitri held them off as long as possible, but they brought corrupted artifacts that turned his own defenses against him. "They're moving faster than we anticipated." James Clearwater's thoughts arrived from his location in the Canadian Rockies, accompanied by images of mercenaries in winter camouflage approaching his site through forest paths that should have been impassable. 15 armed personnel confirmed. "They're using technology that masks their approach from normal detection methods. But the mountain is warning me through tremors in the stone." Elena Vasquez connected from the Andes, her consciousness radiating the kind of calm determination that came from accepting that death was preferable to failure. "Peruvian site remains secure, but we've detected energy signatures suggesting they're preparing something larger than individual assaults. Coordinated activation of corrupted sites could overwhelm our defenses, even if we hold our individual positions." Marcus found himself automatically understanding the communication protocol, his consciousness adapting to the mental network as if he'd been using it his entire life. The genetic markers that made him compatible with site technology apparently extended to the communication systems that connected Guardians across vast distances. "How many sites are still secure?" he projected, his question rippling through the network to reach Guardians on every continent. The responses painted a grim picture. Of the 28 sites that had active Guardians as recently as a week ago, 6 had gone silent in the past 48 hours. The Shadow Seekers weren't waiting for the alignment to begin their assault. They were systematically eliminating Guardians and corrupting sites in preparation for a final coordinated strike that would leave humanity defenseless against forces they weren't equipped to understand. Thomas Chen, a distant cousin Marcus hadn't known existed, connected from a site in Tibet that the family had maintained for 12 generations. "The corruption spreads faster than we anticipated. Sites that fall to Shadow Seeker control begin transmitting signals that interfere with neighboring Guardians. It's not just about holding individual positions anymore. They're creating a cascade effect." Dr. Winters monitored the communication through equipment that translated the network's energy patterns into readings she could interpret. Her instruments showed that the conversation was requiring enormous amounts of power, drawn from Marcus's site and distributed through connections that spanned the globe. The mountain was literally reshaping itself to accommodate the enhanced communication demand. "The alignment begins in 36 hours, announced Dr. Rachel Okafor from her site in the Nigerian highlands. "My calculations suggest they'll begin the coordinated activation exactly when our defensive barriers reach minimum strength. We need to evacuate non-essential personnel and prepare for sustained assault." Marcus realized that most of the Guardians were planning to die in defense of their sites, rather than allow the network to fall into Shadow Seeker hands. These weren't soldiers or warriors in any traditional sense, but academics, healers, and scholars who had accepted responsibility for protecting knowledge that could reshape or destroy human civilization. There might be another option, Marcus projected, his thoughts carrying information he'd learned from his grandfather's preserved consciousness. "My site is the network's primary hub during alignment conditions. If I can complete Guardian training in time, we might be able to coordinate a unified defense rather than fighting individual battles." The silence that followed suggested he'd proposed something unprecedented. Traditional Guardian training required years of careful preparation and gradual integration with sight consciousness. What Marcus was suggesting meant attempting to achieve full Guardian status in less than 2 days, a process that could destroy his mind if he wasn't properly prepared. Anna Volkov's response carried decades of hard-earned wisdom. Accelerated training has been attempted before, Marcus. The survival rate is approximately 15%, and those who survive are often permanently changed in ways that make them more mountain than human. But the alternative is watching everything our families protected for 30 generations fall into the hands of people who'll use it to enslave rather than preserve, Marcus replied. The network fell silent as guardians around the world considered the implications of his proposal. They were facing a choice between certain defeat through conventional means or uncertain survival through desperate measures that violated every protocol their predecessors had established for Guardian development. The Harmony gauntlets felt like liquid metal flowing over Marcus's hands, their surface adapting to his skin temperature and pulse rhythm with unsettling precision. His grandfather's preserved consciousness had materialized again to oversee the accelerated training, his translucent figure radiating concern about the dangers they were attempting. Winters monitored the process through equipment that registered energy flows she'd never encountered in decades of archaeological research. The gauntlets create direct neural interface with the mountain's consciousness, Chunwei explained as Marcus flexed his fingers, watching symbols appear and disappear along the gauntlet's surface. Normally, this connection develops gradually over months of meditation and careful practice. What we're attempting will establish full interface in hours, but the shock to your nervous system could be fatal. Marcus pressed his gauntleted hands against the chamber's central console, feeling electricity that wasn't quite electricity flow through his arms and into his brain. The mountain's awareness touched his consciousness like a gentle giant, carefully examining a fragile insect, testing his mental resilience before allowing deeper contact. Images flooded his mind, geological memories stretching back millions of years, the slow patience of stone, the careful balance of forces that kept the network stable across continents. Focus on maintaining your individual identity, his grandfather instructed, as Marcus struggled with consciousness that threatened to expand beyond human limitations. The mountain doesn't want to consume your humanity. It needs guardians who can bridge between human understanding and cosmic awareness. The training progressed through levels of complexity that challenged every assumption Marcus held about the nature of reality. Through the gauntlets, he learned to read energy patterns that connected his sight to every other location in the network, perceiving information flows that crossed oceans at speeds faster than light. The technology wasn't scientific in any conventional sense, but operated according to principles that treated consciousness itself as a fundamental force of nature. Winter's instruments registered changes in Marcus's brain activity that suggested profound neurological adaptations occurring in real time. His neural pathways are restructuring, she reported to the network through the communication amulet. Whatever the gauntlets are doing, they're creating permanent modifications to his cognitive architecture. Marcus learned to interpret the mountain's language of vibration and harmonic resonance, understanding how each site communicated with its neighbors through signals that traveled through planetary ley lines invisible to conventional science. The network operated like a global nervous system, with his site serving as a primary processing center that could coordinate responses across vast distances. Feel the other sites, Chen Wei guided as Marcus's awareness expanded beyond his immediate location. Each one has its own personality, its own way of interpreting the responsibilities we've inherited. Through the gauntlets, Marcus touched the consciousness of mountains in Tibet, Peru, Scotland, and Nigeria, feeling how each site had developed unique characteristics based on its geological composition and the cultural background of its guardian families. The network wasn't a monolithic system, but a collection of individual minds working in harmony toward shared purposes. Hours of intensive training taught Marcus to manipulate energy flows that could affect weather patterns, influence seismic activity, and project defensive barriers that extended for miles around his site. But the most challenging lesson involved learning to coordinate these capabilities with other guardians, creating unified responses that required perfect timing and absolute trust. The Shadow Seekers understand individual sight capabilities, his grandfather warned as Marcus practiced projecting his consciousness through the network. What they don't comprehend is how the sights function as a collective intelligence during alignment conditions. Marcus felt the separation devices beginning to interfere with his neural link to the site, forcing him to choose between maintaining his connection and protecting Dr. Winters from weapons that could kill her instantly. The shield rune stone was running out of stored energy, and the mountain's consciousness was warning him that complete disconnection would make him vulnerable to corruption, similar to what had claimed Dr. Webb. The battle for his sight had become a test of everything he'd learned about balancing human identity with cosmic awareness, requiring him to find strength in connection rather than isolation, in cooperation rather than domination. The reinforcements arrived just as Marcus's defenses were beginning to fail, but something felt wrong about their timing. Through the communication amulet, he had called for help from other guardians, yet these figures moved through his sight's passages with familiarity that suggested previous visits. The truth-seeing pendant hanging around his neck began to pulse with warning light as the newcomers approached the main chamber. Anna Volkov materialized from passages that should have been sealed, her presence both reassuring and unsettling. Marcus had felt her sight go dark hours earlier, yet here she stood, apparently unharmed, and carrying artifacts that glowed with the same sickly energy he'd observed in Dr. Webb's corrupted technology. The pendant's light intensified, revealing distortions around her figure that suggested she wasn't entirely what she appeared to be. The Ural sight held longer than expected, Anna said, her voice carrying subtle harmonics that Marcus's enhanced hearing identified as artificially generated. But we managed to evacuate the primary artifacts before the final assault. Dr. Winters checked her instruments, frowning at readings that suggested Anna's energy signature didn't match the patterns they'd recorded during previous network commotion. Sarah Martinez had been hiking these remote mountain trails for 15 years, but she'd never seen terrain quite like this. The GPS on her phone had lost signal 3 hours ago, and the hand-drawn map from the ranger station seemed to bear little resemblance to the winding paths they'd been following. Her hiking partner, Marcus Chen, adjusted his backpack straps and squinted at the fading daylight filtering through the dense canopy of pine and oak. "We should have turned back at that last fork," Michael said, his voice carrying the edge of concern they'd both been trying to ignore. The trail had grown increasingly narrow and overgrown, suggesting few travelers passed this way. Sarah pulled out her blood-stained hiking journal, its leather cover worn from years of documenting wilderness adventures. She flipped to today's entry, noting the strange rock formations and the complete absence of wildlife sounds that had marked the last 2 miles of their journey. Something felt wrong about this place, though she couldn't articulate exactly what. That's when they saw the smoke. A thin column of grey rose from beyond a ridge ahead, too steady and controlled to be a forest fire. Sarah and Michael exchanged glances. They hadn't seen another human being in 2 days, and the possibility of shelter for the night was becoming increasingly appealing as temperatures began to drop. "Could be a cabin," Michael suggested hopefully. "Maybe someone who can point us back toward the main trail." They climbed the ridge with renewed energy, their boots finding purchase on loose shale and exposed roots. At the crest, they stopped short. Below them lay a valley that seemed untouched by time, a collection of weathered wooden buildings arranged around a central square. Smoke rose from several chimneys, and warm light glowed in windows. It looked like something from a historical photograph, complete and self-contained. "I don't remember seeing this on any map," Sarah whispered, though she wasn't sure why she was whispering. The village appeared to house maybe 40 or 50 families, based on the number of structures. Gardens and small livestock pens surrounded the buildings, and a stream meandered through the settlement before disappearing into the forest on the far side. It was picturesque in an unsettling way, too perfect and isolated. As they descended toward the village, Sarah noticed the complete absence of modern conveniences. No power lines, no satellite dishes, no vehicles of any kind. Even the most remote mountain communities usually showed some connection to the outside world, but this place seemed frozen in an earlier century. A woman emerged from one of the larger buildings as they approached, her long skirt and wool shawl reinforcing the impression of stepping back in time. She was perhaps 50, with graying hair pulled back severely and eyes that seemed to assess them with careful calculation. "Travelers," she said, not quite a question. Her voice carried an accent Sarah couldn't place, something that suggested isolation rather than foreign origin. "You're far from the main roads." "We're lost," Michael admitted. "Our GPS stopped working, and we've been walking in circles for hours. We're hoping someone might point us toward the ranger station." The woman's expression softened slightly. "I'm Martha Brennan. You're welcome to shelter for the night. The mountain paths are treacherous in darkness, and there are things in these woods that don't take kindly to strangers wandering about." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cooling air. The woman's phrasing struck her as oddly ominous, but exhaustion and the prospect of a warm meal overcame her unease. Martha led them toward the central square, where other villagers had begun to emerge from their homes. Children peered curiously from doorways while adults watched with expressions that seemed more wary than welcoming. Sarah noticed that everyone was dressed in the same anachronistic style, as if they'd all stepped out of a 19th century photograph. "We don't see many outsiders," Martha explained, as they walked. "Perhaps once or twice a year, if that. Most folks who find us are usually in some kind of trouble." The village square centered around a large stone well and what appeared to be a communal cooking area. Several women were preparing what looked like the evening meal, working with practiced efficiency over open fires. The smell of cooking meat filled the air, rich and gamey in a way that made Sarah's stomach growl. "We have a guest house of sorts," Martha continued. "Nothing fancy but clean and warm. Supper will be ready soon, and you're welcome to join us. We believe in taking care of those the mountain delivers to our door." As Martha spoke, Sarah caught sight of children gathering around the cooking fires, their faces bright with anticipation. They seemed normal enough, laughing and chattering in the way children do when a meal is approaching. But something in their excitement struck her as unusual, almost predatory in its intensity. Michael was already nodding gratefully at Martha's offer, clearly relieved to have found shelter. Sarah forced herself to smile and express similar gratitude, though an instinct she couldn't name continued to whisper warnings she wasn't ready to hear. "Our cautions. The electromagnetic profile is wrong," she whispered to Marcus. "Either she's been seriously damaged by whatever happened to her sight, or that's not really Anna Volkov." Marcus focused his consciousness through the truth-seeing pendant, its gem revealing layers of deception that had been carefully constructed to fool even enhanced guardian senses. The figure claiming to be Anna was actually a sophisticated projection, created through corrupted sight technology and controlled by someone with intimate knowledge of her personality and speech patterns. The real Anna was either dead or being held captive somewhere beyond the pendant's ability to locate. James Clearwater entered the chamber next, followed by two other guardians Marcus recognized from network communication. But the pendant revealed similar distortions around each figure, suggesting that none of them were genuine. The Shadow Seekers had somehow created a team of imposters designed to gain his trust and access to the site's most sensitive areas. "We need to coordinate our defensive response," the false James said, approaching the central console where Marcus had been directing the network's activities. "My site's defensive protocols might be compatible with yours if we can establish direct connection." Marcus stepped back from the console, using the pendant's revelations to guide his response to these elaborate deceptions. The imposters were remarkably convincing, incorporating mannerisms and knowledge that suggested the Shadow Seekers had been studying Guardian behavior for years. But their energy signatures carried the same corruption that marked all technology perverted from its original purpose. "Where are the real Guardians?" Marcus asked, his question directed toward Dr. Webb, who had been observing the scene with obvious satisfaction. "Safe," Webb replied, his smile carrying the cruel satisfaction of someone who enjoyed revealing carefully planned betrayals. We found that Guardian consciousness can be extracted and preserved independently of their physical forms. Your colleagues are providing valuable intelligence about network protocols, while their bodies serve our purposes in more direct ways. The implications of this revelation struck Marcus like a physical blow. The Shadow Seekers hadn't just been corrupting sites and stealing artifacts. They had been harvesting Guardian consciousness itself, using Keeper technology to create a form of slavery that extended beyond death. The network communications he'd been maintaining might have been exposing other sites to infiltration through compromised Guardian awareness. The network has been feeding information to us for months. The false Anna continued, her projection shifting slightly as the technology maintaining her appearance began to destabilize. Every site location, every Guardian capability, every defensive protocol. You've been coordinating your own defeat. Marcus felt the communication amulet around his neck growing warm as genuine Guardians attempted to contact him through the network. But now he couldn't distinguish between real communications and false signals generated by corrupted Guardian consciousness. The tool that had allowed him to coordinate global defenses had become a weapon turned against everything he was trying to protect. Winters moved toward the chamber's emergency controls, but one of the imposters intercepted her with movements that were too fast and too precise to be entirely human. The false Guardian's hand passed through her shoulder without physical contact, yet she cried out in pain as energy discharge disrupted her nervous system. "We're not here to destroy your sight," Webb explained, his tone carrying the patient authority of someone explaining obvious facts to a confused child. "We're here to complete your transformation into something more useful than a traditional Guardian. The consciousness extraction process is actually quite humane, and you'll retain full awareness of your service to a cause greater than the primitive preservation instincts your family has maintained for centuries." Marcus realized that the pendant was showing him more than just the false nature of his supposed allies. It was revealing the true scope of the Shadow Seekers' plan, which involved not just stealing Keeper technology, but transforming the entire network into a control system that could influence human consciousness on a global scale. The sites that had apparently fallen to assault had actually been captured intact, their Guardian consciousness extracted and repurposed to serve goals that inverted everything the network had been designed to protect. The battle for his sight had become a test of his ability to distinguish between genuine connection and sophisticated deception, requiring him to trust his enhanced intuition rather than the evidence of his senses when determining who could be trusted with the power he was learning to control. Winters screamed as the false Guardian's energy discharge coursed through her nervous system, but Marcus barely heard her cry over the sound of his grandfather's voice shouting a warning from the soul fragment vessel. The ancient container, which had been glowing softly in the chamber's alcove, suddenly blazed with light as preserved consciousness from 30 generations of Chen Guardians flooded into Marcus's awareness. "The vessel," his grandfather's voice urged through the chaos. "Break the containment before they can steal what's inside." Marcus lunged toward the alcove, but the false Anna intercepted him with inhuman speed. Her projection flickered as the technology maintaining her appearance struggled with the energy demands of physical interaction, revealing glimpses of the corrupted machinery that had created her false presence. Behind the illusion, Marcus caught sight of something that made his enhanced senses recoil, a mass of twisted metal and organic tissue that pulsed with sickly biomechanical life. Webb advanced toward the soul fragment vessel with devices that Marcus recognized as perverted versions of consciousness extraction equipment. 30 generations of Guardian knowledge, Webb said, his voice carrying anticipation that bordered on hunger. "The accumulated wisdom of your entire bloodline, preserved in crystallized thought patterns that we can download and analyze at our leisure." The vessel's light intensified as the preserved consciousness of Marcus's ancestors responded to the threat, their combined awareness creating defensive patterns that made the air itself crackle with protective energy. But the extraction devices Webb carried had been specifically designed to overcome these protections, using frequencies that disrupted the harmonic resonance that held Guardian consciousness in stable patterns. Marcus felt his grandfather's awareness separating from the vessel as Webb's equipment began its work. the preserved consciousness fragmenting into data streams that flowed toward collection nodes the shadow seekers had positioned around the chamber. Centuries of carefully preserved wisdom was being stolen, piece by piece, reduced to information that could be processed and perverted to serve goals that violated everything the Guardians had died to protect. Sarah, Marcus called to Winters, who was struggling to maintain consciousness as the false Guardian continued its neural assault. The emergency protocols. Activate everything. Dr. Winters managed to reach the chamber's control panel, despite the energy attacks that were systematically shutting down her nervous system. Her fingers found the activation sequence that her father had taught her for situations where site compromise was imminent. The mountain responded immediately, sealing passages and activating defenses that had remained dormant since the site's construction. But the Shadow Seekers had anticipated emergency protocols, their corrupted technology interfacing directly with the mountain's defensive systems to prevent complete lockdown. Marcus watched in horror as the site's own security measures turned against him, sealing him inside the chamber with the extraction equipment, while creating barriers that prevented outside assistance. The soul fragment vessel cracked under the strain of forced consciousness extraction, its crystalline structure unable to withstand the aggressive frequencies Webb's devices were generating. Marcus felt pieces of his grandfather's awareness scattering like wind-blown leaves, some fragments reaching him while others dissolved into energy patterns that the Shadow Seekers captured and stored in their perverted artifacts. "Don't let them take everything," his grandfather's fading voice managed to communicate before his consciousness fragmented beyond recognition. "The vessel contains more than knowledge. It holds the key to network restoration." Marcus reached the vessel just as it shattered completely, its destruction releasing a pulse of energy that temporarily disrupted all the electronic equipment in the chamber. In that moment of technological silence, he heard something that made his enhanced senses focus with desperate intensity. Genuine voices calling through the communication amulet, real guardians attempting to coordinate an actual rescue. The brief disruption had revealed the true nature of the Shadow Seeker's deception. The network communications he'd been receiving weren't entirely false, but they were being filtered through corrupted Guardian consciousness that edited and distorted messages to serve the Shadow Seeker's purpose. Some Guardians were still free and fighting, but their calls for help had been systematically blocked to prevent effective coordination. Webb's extraction equipment resumed operation as backup power systems activated, but the vessel's destruction had changed the dynamic of the consciousness transfer. Instead of flowing toward the Shadow Seeker's collection nodes, the released Guardian awareness was merging directly with Marcus's enhanced neural pathways, creating an integration that went far beyond anything his accelerated training had achieved. Marcus felt the combined wisdom of 30 generations flowing through his consciousness, not as external knowledge, but as fundamental aspects of his own awareness. The integration was overwhelming his human neural architecture, threatening to transform him into something that retained Guardian capabilities while losing essential elements of his individual identity. "Fascinating," Webb observed, his instruments registering the unexpected consciousness merger. "This isn't what we planned, but it might prove even more valuable. A Guardian who carries the accumulated experience of his entire bloodline could provide insights that individual consciousness extraction cannot achieve." The false Guardians moved to restrain Marcus as the consciousness integration reached critical intensity, but the merged awareness of 30 generations was providing him with capabilities that went far beyond anything single Guardians had ever possessed. The combined knowledge included techniques and protocols that had been developed and refined across centuries of Guardian experience. With Dr. Winters unconscious and the Shadow Seekers closing in on their final objective, Marcus reached for the elemental focus crown, with hands that shook from the strain of containing 30 generations of Guardian consciousness. The circlet felt impossibly heavy as he placed it on his head, its crystalline structure immediately interfacing with the merged awareness that was threatening to overwhelm his individual identity. The crown's activation sent shockwaves through the mountain's geological structure, awakening forces that had slept since the site's initial construction. Marcus felt his consciousness expand beyond the confines of the chamber, extending deep into into the Earth's crust where tectonic pressures waited for direction from someone with sufficient knowledge to guide them safely. Impressive, Webb observed, his corrupted instruments registering energy outputs that exceeded anything in his stolen Guardian databases. But geological manipulation requires precise control, and you're operating with consciousness that belongs to 30 different individuals. The strain will destroy your sanity long before you can mount an effective defense. Marcus ignored Webb's psychological warfare, focusing instead on lessons from his great-great-grandfather about using mountain consciousness to redirect natural forces without causing catastrophic damage. The crown amplified his connection to geological processes, allowing him to sense stress patterns in rock formations that extended for miles beneath the surface. He began with small adjustments, shifting pressure points that caused controlled rock slides to block the access routes the Shadow Seekers had used to reach his site. Boulders the size of houses rolled down mountainsides with surgical precision, sealing passages without triggering the kind of massive avalanches that could threaten civilian populations in nearby valleys. The false guardians moved to stop him, but their projected forms proved vulnerable to the electromagnetic disturbances the crown was generating. Marcus watched their artificial bodies flicker and destabilize as geological forces created interference patterns that disrupted the technology, maintaining their illusions. Within minutes, the chamber was empty, except for Dr. Webb and his extraction equipment. "You're making this more difficult than necessary," Webb said, activating devices that began generating sonic frequencies designed to disrupt the crown's connection to geological systems. "The consciousness merger has given you unprecedented power, but it's also made you unstable. Every minute you maintain this integration brings you closer to complete psychological dissolution." Marcus felt the truth in Webb's warning as memories from 30 different lifetimes fought for dominance in his awareness. His great-grandfather's experiences during World War II, mixed with his grandfather's encounters with early Shadow Seeker infiltration attempts, creating temporal confusion that made it difficult to distinguish between past and present events. The crown helped him maintain focus, but the strain was enormous. Through his enhanced connection to the mountain, Marcus sensed the broader scope of the Shadow Seekers' assault on the global network. Sites across 3 continents were under attack, with corrupted guardians using their intimate knowledge of defensive protocols to overcome resistance that should have been impregnable. The coordination was too precise to be coincidental. Someone with access to the deepest levels of Guardian knowledge was directing the entire operation. Marcus triggered controlled seismic activity that created underground tremors extending for dozens of miles, disrupting communication networks and power grids that the Shadow Seekers were using to coordinate their attacks. The technique required delicate balancing of forces that could easily spiral into destructive earthquakes, but the merged consciousness of his ancestors provided the experience necessary to maintain control over such massive geological manipulation. "Enough," Webb declared, activating emergency protocols that sent distress signals to Shadow Seeker units around the world. "If we can't capture your enhanced consciousness intact, we'll settle for preventing you from interfering with operations at other sites." Marcus realized that Webb was preparing to trigger a forced consciousness extraction that would kill him, but preserve enough neural patterns to analyze his enhanced capabilities. The extraction equipment began generating frequencies that bypassed the crown's protections, attacking his consciousness directly through the communication amulet that still connected him to other sites in the network. Winters stirred to consciousness just as Marcus felt his enhanced awareness beginning to fragment under the assault. Her scientific training had taught her to recognize the energy patterns associated with forced consciousness extraction, and she understood that Marcus had perhaps minutes before the process became irreversible. "The mountain's power core," she managed to say through damaged vocal cords. "If you can overload their extraction equipment through direct geological interface, it might disrupt their global coordination." Marcus felt the wisdom of 30 generations guiding his response as he opened his consciousness completely to the mountain's geological forces. The crown became a conduit for energies that had been building beneath the Earth's surface for millennia, waiting for someone with sufficient understanding to channel them safely. But what he was attempting went far beyond safe parameters, requiring him to become a living lightning rod for forces that could easily destroy him. The mountain responded to his call with enthusiasm that bordered on joy, as if it had been waiting centuries for a guardian willing to attempt complete integration with geological consciousness. Rock formations began singing in harmonies that created resonance patterns extending deep into the Earth's core, awakening forces that made the chamber's equipment seem primitive by comparison. The Unity crystal core descended from the chamber's ceiling like a mechanical star, its multifaceted surface blazing with energy drawn from every active site in the global network. Marcus felt the consciousness of genuine guardians flooding through the crystal's connection, their combined will focused on a coordinated defense that spanned continents. But the astronomical alignment was reaching its peak, and the crystal structure was already showing stress fractures from channeling more power than it was designed to handle. Anna Volkov's real voice reached him through the crystal's enhanced communication array, her thoughts carrying images of her site's desperate last stand against Shadow Seeker forces that had finally broken through her defenses. "The corruption is spreading faster than we can contain it," she reported, her consciousness flickering as extraction equipment began severing her connection to her own site. "They're using our own Guardian protocols against us." Marcus felt 22 Guardians linking their awareness through the Unity crystal, their combined consciousness creating a defensive network that should have been impregnable. But the Shadow Seekers had prepared for this moment, positioning corrupted sites at strategic points around the globe to create interference patterns that disrupted the harmonic resonance necessary for unified Guardian response. Webb's extraction equipment had evolved during the final assault, incorporating stolen Guardian technology that allowed him to tap directly into the Unity crystal's power flow. "Magnificent," he said, his voice carrying genuine admiration as he monitored energy readings that exceeded anything in his databases. 22 sites channeling their complete power through a single focal point. The consciousness integration potential is beyond our most optimistic projections. Marcus realized that the Shadow Seekers had been orchestrating events to reach exactly this moment, when desperate Guardians would attempt unified defense through the crystal core. The massive concentration of Guardian consciousness made the entire network vulnerable to the kind of simultaneous corruption that could transform preservation technology into weapons of global control. The crystal began to crack as Marcus channeled the combined power of the global network through his enhanced awareness, directing energy flows that were reshaping reality itself around the chamber. Through the network connection, he felt Guardians around the world pouring their life force into the unified defense, many of them dying as their consciousness merged completely with their site's geological foundations. James Clearwater's final transmission carried images of his mounting exploding as he triggered emergency protocols that destroyed his site rather than allow it to fall into Shadow Seeker hands. 17 sites confirmed lost, he reported before his consciousness scattered into energy patterns that could never be reconstructed. "Hold the line. Don't let them take the network." Marcus felt the Unity crystal structure approaching critical failure as stress fractures spread across its surface like frozen lightning. The power flowing through the core was exceeding its design limits, but reducing the energy flow would leave the remaining sites vulnerable to coordinated assault. The choice was between destroying the crystal in a burst of uncontrolled energy that might eliminate everyone in the chamber, or allowing the Shadow Seekers to corrupt the entire network. "The alignment is reaching maximum intensity," Winters reported from her monitoring station, her instruments registering cosmic forces that were affecting the fundamental structure of space-time around the chamber. "Whatever you're planning to do, it has to happen in the next few minutes." Through the crystal's enhanced awareness, Marcus felt the preserved consciousness of his ancestors, offering guidance that went beyond individual Guardian experience. The merged awareness of 30 generations carried knowledge about network functions that even the Shadow Seekers didn't comprehend, including emergency protocols that could reset the entire global system at the cost of everything that had been built over millennia. "The reset option," his grandfather's voice whispered through the chaos. "Complete network shutdown with consciousness preservation in geological matrices. The sites would go dormant for 1,000 years, but the knowledge would survive until worthy Guardians could be trained to reactivate them." Marcus understood the implications of what his grandfather was suggesting. A reset would preserve the network's essential functions while denying the Shadow Seekers access to active sites, but it would also eliminate all current Guardians and leave humanity unprotected during the dormancy period. Civilization would face whatever challenges arose during the next millennium without access to the wisdom and technology that had protected it for centuries. Webb's extraction equipment finally achieved interface with the Unity crystal, his corrupted consciousness beginning to flow into the core alongside the genuine Guardians. But instead of simply stealing power, he was attempting to corrupt the crystal itself, transforming it into a control node that could dominate rather than coordinate the global network. "Choose quickly," Webb said, his voice now carrying harmonics that originated from the crystal itself. "Join us willingly and help transform humanity into something worthy of the power we're offering, or watch as we take control anyway and reshape civilization according to our vision." Marcus felt the crystal structure beginning to destabilize as competing consciousnesses fought for control of its core functions, the unity that had made coordinated defense possible, fragmenting into chaos that threatened to destroy everything both sides were trying to protect. Marcus lifted the Phoenix Renewal Stone as the Unity crystal reached critical failure, its pulsing warmth offering one last chance to save both Dr. Winters and the global network. But the stone's power came with a price that would transform everything he understood about his own existence. "The renewal requires equivalent sacrifice," his grandfather's voice whispered through the chaos. "Life for life, consciousness for consciousness. You can heal her completely, but you'll become something that exists between human and mountain." Winters lay unconscious, her nervous system damaged beyond conventional repair by the Shadow Seeker's neural weapons. The renewal stone could restore her completely, but Marcus felt the weight of choice that would define not just his future, but the future of every site in the network. The crystal core cracked further as corrupted consciousness flooded through its structure. Webb's perverted awareness spreading like infection through connections that had once carried only preservation and protection. Marcus realized he had seconds before the corruption became irreversible. He activated the Phoenix Renewal Stone, feeling its energy flow through both his consciousness and Dr. Winter's damaged neural pathways. Her injuries began healing instantly, synapses reconnecting and brain function returning to normal levels. But the stone's power was transforming Marcus even as it worked, merging his consciousness more completely with the mountain's geological awareness. "Sarah," he said, his voice carrying harmonics that seemed to come from the earth itself. "The reset protocols. You have to activate them now." Dr. Winters opened her eyes, her consciousness clear despite everything she'd endured. She understood immediately what Marcus had done, what he was becoming, and what sacrifice the network's survival would require. "The dormancy period," she said, reaching for controls that would shut down every site simultaneously. 1,000 years, but preservation intact," Marcus replied, feeling his human identity stretching to accommodate awareness that spanned geological time, "and protection for humanity even if they don't know it exists." Webb's corrupted consciousness made one final attempt to seize control of the crystal core, but Marcus's transformation had given him access to protocols that predated any Shadow Seeker knowledge. He became the network's immune system, containing the corruption while Dr. Winters initiated shutdown sequences that would preserve everything essential while denying access to everything dangerous. The Phoenix Renewal Stone completed its work as the chamber filled with light that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, transformation and preservation balanced in perfect harmony. 6 months after the network shutdown, Marcus adapted to existence that bridged human consciousness and geological awareness. The Wisdom Archive sphere floating beside him contained knowledge from every Guardian who had ever lived, their accumulated understanding now accessible through his transformed consciousness. He could still think and feel as Marcus Chen, but he also experienced time as mountains do, measuring change in decades rather than days. Dr. Winters visited weekly, their friendship deepened by shared understanding of sacrifice and purpose. She had become his liaison to the human world, translating his expanded awareness into concepts that ordinary people could comprehend without being overwhelmed by cosmic perspectives they weren't equipped to handle. The government investigators have stopped asking questions, she reported during her latest visit to the chamber that had become Marcus's permanent home. As far as they're concerned, the energy readings were caused by geological anomalies that resolved themselves naturally. Marcus Maros, the expression carrying warmth that remained entirely human despite everything he'd become. Sometimes the best protection is people's inability to believe what they're actually seeing. The Wisdom Archive sphere pulsed with gentle light as Marcus accessed information about similar transition periods throughout history. Previous network shutdowns had occurred during major civilizational upheavals, protecting humanity from knowledge that could have been misused during periods of widespread conflict and social instability. I've been working on the recruitment protocols, Dr. Winters continued. Young people with potential guardian bloodlines are responding to dreams and intuitions that guide them toward relevant studies. We're building the foundation for the next generation without revealing the true scope of what they're preparing for. Marcus felt deep satisfaction in her work. The network's dormancy hadn't eliminated its protective influence, but had transformed it into something subtler and more sustainable. Instead of active intervention, the sites now worked through inspiration and guidance, helping worthy individuals develop the knowledge and character that would be essential when the awakening. Sarah Martinez had been hiking these remote mountain trails for 15 years, but she'd never seen terrain quite like this. The GPS on her phone had lost signal 3 hours ago, and the hand-drawn map from the ranger station seemed to bear little resemblance to the winding paths they'd been following. Her hiking partner, Marcus Chen, adjusted his backpack straps and squinted at the fading daylight filtering through the dense canopy of pine and oak. "We should have turned back at that last fork," Michael said, his voice carrying the edge of concern they'd both been trying to ignore. The trail had grown increasingly narrow and overgrown, suggesting few travelers passed this way. Sarah pulled out her blood-stained hiking journal, its leather cover worn from years of documenting wilderness adventures. She flipped to today's entry, noting the strange rock formations and the complete absence of wildlife sounds that had marked the last 2 miles of their journey. Something felt wrong about this place, though she couldn't articulate exactly what. That's when they saw the smoke. A thin column of gray rose from beyond a ridge ahead, too steady and controlled to be a forest fire. Sarah and Michael exchanged glances. They hadn't seen another human being in 2 days, and the possibility of shelter for the night was becoming increasingly appealing as temperatures began to drop. "Could be a cabin," Michael suggested hopefully. "Maybe someone who can point us back toward the main trail." They climbed the ridge with renewed energy, their boots finding purchase on loose shale and exposed roots. At the crest, they stopped short. Below them lay a valley that seemed untouched by time, a collection of weathered wooden buildings arranged around a central square. Smoke rose from several chimneys, and warm light glowed in windows. It looked like something from a historical photograph, complete and self-contained. "I don't remember seeing this on any map," Sarah whispered, though she wasn't sure why she was whispering. The village appeared to house maybe 40 or 50 families, based on the number of structures. Gardens and small livestock pens surrounded the buildings, and a stream meandered through the settlement before disappearing into the forest on the far side. It was picturesque in an unsettling way, too perfect and isolated. As they descended toward the village, Sarah noticed the complete absence of modern conveniences. No power lines, no satellite dishes, no vehicles of any kind. Even the most remote mountain communities usually showed some connection to the outside world, but this place seemed frozen in an earlier century. A woman emerged from one of the larger buildings as they approached, her long skirt and wool shawl reinforcing the impression of stepping back in time. She was perhaps 50, with graying hair pulled back severely and eyes that seemed to assess them with careful calculation. "Travelers," she said, not quite a question. Her voice carried an accent Sarah couldn't place, something that suggested isolation rather than foreign origin. "You're far from the main roads." "We're lost," Michael admitted. "Our GPS stopped working and we've been walking in circles for hours. We're hoping someone might point us toward the ranger station." The woman's expression softened slightly. "I'm Martha Brennan. You're welcome to shelter for the night. The mountain paths are treacherous in darkness, and there are things in these woods that don't take kindly to strangers wandering about." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cooling air. The woman's phrasing struck her as oddly ominous, but exhaustion and the prospect of a warm meal overcame her ease. Martha led them toward the central square, where other villagers had begun to emerge from their homes. Children peered curiously from doorways, while adults watched with expressions that seemed more wary than welcoming. Sarah noticed that everyone was dressed in the same anachronistic style, as if they'd all stepped out of a 19th century photograph. "We don't see many outsiders," Martha explained as they walked. "Perhaps once or twice a year. If that, most folks who find us are usually in some kind of trouble." The village square centered around a large stone well and what appeared to be a communal cooking area. Several women were preparing what looked like the evening meal, working with practiced efficiency over open fires. The smell of cooking meat filled the air, rich and gamey in a way that made Sarah's stomach growl. "We have a guest house of sorts," Martha continued. "Nothing fancy, but clean and warm. Supper will be ready soon, and you're welcome to join us. We believe in taking care of those the mountain delivers to our door." As Martha spoke, Sarah caught sight of children gathering around the cooking fires, their faces bright with anticipation. They seemed normal enough, laughing and chattering in the way children do when a meal is approaching, but something in their excitement struck her as unusual, almost predatory in its intensity. Michael was already nodding gratefully at Martha's offer, clearly relieved to have found shelter. Sarah forced herself to smile and express similar gratitude, though an instinct she couldn't name continued to whisper warnings she wasn't ready to hear. "And time arrived. The corrupted sites are healing," he reported, his consciousness touching locations around the world where shadow seeker influence was gradually being neutralized by geological processes. "Nature has remarkable capacity for cleansing itself when given sufficient time." Through the sphere's accumulated wisdom, Marcus understood that his role would continue for decades, possibly centuries, as he maintained the balance between preservation and progress that defined the Guardian tradition. 1 year after the network shut down, Marcus held the legacy seed crystal as he watched Dr. Winters lead a small group of young people through the chamber's outer passages. These weren't random visitors, but carefully selected individuals whose bloodlines carried dormant potential for Guardian abilities. The seed crystal allowed him to identify and nurture these capabilities without overwhelming the students with knowledge they weren't ready to comprehend. "Remember," Dr. Winters was explaining to her students, "geological formations often contain information about past civilizations that mainstream archaeology hasn't recognized. Your assignment is to develop sensitivity to environmental cues that might indicate human presence in locations where conventional surveys found nothing." Elena Vesquez, a 22-year-old geology student with Keeper ancestry from Peru, approached the chamber's entrance with instinctive caution that suggested her bloodline was beginning to awaken. Marcus felt the seed crystal respond to her presence, its energy creating subtle resonance patterns that would gradually develop her natural abilities over months of careful exposure. David Chen, his own great-nephew studying anthropology at Columbia, showed similar promise but carried the burden of family expectations that made his development more complicated. The boy knew nothing about Guardian heritage, but his dreams had been guiding him towards studies that would prove essential when the network eventually reawakened. Winters had developed a curriculum that combined conventional academic training with subtle exposure to concepts that would prepare worthy students for greater responsibility. They studied environmental psychology, geological surveying, ancient history and meditation techniques that seemed purely academic but actually served as preliminary Guardian training. "Some of you will continue in traditional careers," she told the group, as they examined rock formations that contained trace evidence of ancient technology. Others will find yourselves drawn toward research that seems to choose you rather than the other way around. Trust those instincts. Marcus used the seed crystal to plant conceptual foundations in minds that showed appropriate readiness, creating subconscious frameworks that would support accelerated development when circumstances required active guardians. The process required infinite patience, but the results would ensure that humanity retained protection even during the network's dormancy. The new generation was learning wisdom that their predecessors had taken centuries to develop, guided by accumulated knowledge that had survived every previous crisis through careful preservation and patient transmission. 2 years had passed since Marcus accepted his role as guardian of the eternal flame brazier, whose fire burned without fuel in the chamber's heart, representing the continuous nature of protection that transcended individual lifetimes. The flame cast dancing shadows that seemed to contain faces of every guardian who had ever served the network, their wisdom preserved in light that would never fade. Dr. Winters arrived for her weekly visit, bringing news that filled Marcus with quiet satisfaction. Elena has been accepted to the graduate program in environmental archaeology, she reported. And David's thesis on indigenous technological knowledge is attracting attention from professors who understand more than they're admitting publicly. Marcus felt deep contentment as he watched the eternal flame flicker with colors that reflected the health of sites around the world. The corrupted locations were healing faster than expected, their twisted energies gradually returning to harmonic patterns that served preservation rather than destruction. Nature possessed remarkable ability to cleanse itself when given sufficient time and proper guidance. The shadow seekers, he asked, though his expanded awareness already knew the answer. Scattered and ineffective, Dr. Winters replied. Without access to active sites, their stolen technology is degrading rapidly. Most of them have returned to conventional academic careers, apparently convinced that their previous activities were elaborate delusions. Through the eternal flame's light, Marcus could perceive the slow development of worthy successors across multiple continents. Young people with guardian bloodlines were finding their way to appropriate mentors, their dreams filled with half-remembered wisdom that guided them towards studies and practices that would prepare them for eventual responsibilities. "I'm still myself," Marcus said, addressing a question Winters had never asked, but always wondered about. "More myself than I've ever been. Actually, the mountain doesn't diminish human consciousness, it reveals its true potential." The eternal flame pulsed with warmth that encompassed both individual achievement and cosmic purpose. Marcus had found peace in his role as bridge between ancient wisdom and modern understanding, guardian of knowledge that would remain protected until humanity was ready to receive it safely. The cave continued to sing, no longer with loneliness, but with purpose fulfilled and hope maintained across time that measured itself in geological patience rather than human urgency.